Today, the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston brings you a conversation with Dr. Rachel McCormick, Canada's Consul General to Texas. My name is Mary Ann Maldonado, CEO of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, an organization focused on better understanding of world issues. Before we begin, I'd like to say a special hello to all of our members and students of the World Affairs Council of Houston. If you're a member, thank you. I know you're being proud of being a part of Houston's premier organization for bipartisan understanding. Do be watching your emails for some exciting new updates on membership that we will be sharing with you soon. If you're not a member and would like to join us in global learning, visit our website at WAC Houston for more information. And if you'd like to receive all our online programs, be sure to hit the subscribe button below to stay engaged and be connected. Today, we're delighted to welcome to the program Dr. Rachel McCormick. Dr. McCormick is Canada's Consul General to Texas and the surrounding states of New Mexico, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. As many of you may know, Canada is Texas' second largest export market after Mexico. Prior to her appointment to Texas, she headed the Energy and Environmental section of the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. During her time in D.C., she had many experiences that have brought her all the way up to where she is today. She not only headed the environmental section for the Canadian Embassy in Washington, but she was an active part of several political changes on both sides of the border during her time in D.C. She saw in 2015 Justin Trudeau be elected as Canada's Prime Minister with a Liberal Party majority, following almost a decade of conservative government. Then in 2016, Donald Trump is elected president to follow Barack Obama. Then NAFTA renegotiations begin. And now it's NAFTA 2.0, now called USMCA, is ratified and will go into effect on July 1st of this year. She has also participated in discussions in the decades-long fight to build the Keystone Pipeline. She holds a PhD in environmental science from the University of Calgary. It's our pleasure to welcome the Consul General again. Welcome to Texas. Welcome to Houston. Welcome to the World Affairs Program.
Thank you so much, Mary Ann. It's great to be with you. I've had the chance and pleasure to get down to Houston quite a few times since I arrived last summer. And I hope that soon we'll all be in a position where we can be together physically, but very happy to join you today virtually.
Thank you again. Well, you've had such an interesting diplomatic and energy background in your career. Tell us what intrigued you most and why you wanted to go into the Foreign Service.
So it was an interesting trajectory for me. I was always really interested in the intersection between the economy and the environment. And so originally I thought I was going to go into commerce. And then I decided I really wanted to think more at the international level. And so I started looking at environmental programs. And then I eventually went to grad school and decided to focus my research on how environmental considerations could be integrated into international trade and foreign direct investment, and use the energy sector as a focus of research as well. And that led me to working with the foreign affairs in Canada and looking at environmental assessments of trade agreements and things like that. And I got really intrigued by that work. I took on a contract position working on the G7 summit when Canada hosted in the late 1990s. Actually, it was the first summit right after 9/11, so it was early 2000s. And then I also went and worked at the World Trade Organization in the Trade and Environment Division, and I was hooked. And I really wanted to continue to work in that area, and so I joined what is now called Global Affairs Canada, and that's history.
Mm-hmm. An amazing story has brought you here to Texas. And Canada has been such a wonderful North American partner and neighbor. We've been friends, allies, trading partners, partners in defense, just to name a few. So we have a really special, unique relationship, just to say the least. What would you say is our country's best partnership strength?
It's so hard. I think we're connected through history. We're connected through people. We're connected through business. And what I can say, having been in the United States for the last 6 years and also working alongside Americans in various multilateral fora before this, is that we have a lot of shared interests, shared principles in terms of what we want to achieve. The longest undefended border in the world, one of the biggest trading blocs in the world, actually the biggest when Mexico is included. But I think a lot of it is the people connections, historic connections. I hardly ever meet anyone that doesn't know, have a cousin or an aunt or an uncle or some sort of connection or a business that is founded in a supply chain connected with Canada. So it's really hard to pick one. I do think that one of the strengths of our relationship that is always under-recognized is actually with respect to security and defense. And those historic connections are really, really important. We have actually over 700 Canadian Armed Forces serving here across the United States, 19 right here in Texas. In Oklahoma, we have the largest detachment at the Tinker Air Force Base. And I think those examples of how we work side by side in military operations are really underknown. But it also is a testament of the fact that we just work so well and seamlessly together.
Mm-hmm. So true. And we do work seamlessly together. Of course, we all know about the energy connection, Canada being the largest international supplier of crude oil to the U.S. What do you see in this environment on the horizon for the future of this demand?
Yeah, I think that there is going to be demand for energy, crude included, going forward. And I'm glad you mentioned that Canada is such a big supplier to the United States. We have actually 70 pipelines that go back and forth, over 30 transmission lines that take our energy products back and forth between Canada and the U.S. And I think people don't realize just how integrated our energy systems are. When you look at the electricity system, it actually runs more north-south than it does east-west. And Canadian crude that comes down to the U.S. fuels jobs and productivity in refineries, and then a lot of that is actually exported and bringing value to the economy in the U.S. And that increase in how much Canada is exporting to the U.S. is actually really instrumental in terms of what's happened over the last 15 years or so. So if you think about it, in 2005, U.S. crude oil imports peaked at 10 million barrels around. And about 48% of that came from OPEC and 16% from Canada. In 2019, 56% came from Canada and 22% from OPEC. So during that time, of course, there's been a huge boom in the U.S. in terms of energy production, but the U.S. has reduced its crude oil imports by a quarter, cut its imports from OPEC by almost 70%, and doubled its imports from Canada. So I think that's a real testament to the North American energy security story that we have been building together bilaterally in North America.
So much has occurred, so much has gone on in our relationships, and there's been some interesting changes in government policies in Canada recently for the energy industry. Can you tell us the status of not just Keystone, but pipelines connecting to Canadian oil, especially from Alberta to those Texas and Gulf Coast refineries?
Sure, of course. So I always say the Keystone XL pipeline is the most famous pipeline that's never been built, but it's actually part of a really big pipeline network that's bringing Canadian oil down to Nebraska, but then also over to Illinois and all the way down to Houston. It's an existing network. So that Keystone XL will bring another 830,000 barrels per day, approved in Canada in 2010. So 10 years ago, and about 10 years of consideration here in the United States. And so right now there are continued challenges in state and federal courts through the district courts in Montana, as well as an additional case that's been brought in Montana from a tribe challenging some permits from both the Army Corps and the Bureau of Land Management. And I think the conversation has been important. So one of the things I always talk about is the fact that Canada is the only oil exporting nation to the United States that passes an infrastructure test. Every other country's oil comes from the coast. It comes in off of a ship. So they don't have to build a pipeline to expand how much they're actually getting to the United States. So that's a very specific thing to Canada. And so I think it's been a really important conversation that often talks about the relationship, the energy and environment nexus. And so I always like to emphasize to people, because sometimes there's narratives out there that aren't quite accurate. The real strong commitment Canada has on climate. So I think a lot of this is derived from a conversation about climate change. And oil sands producers, which is a lot of where the crude would come from for KXL, have actually cut their intensity of their emissions per barrel by 28% since 2000. We have a price on carbon, so we have a price on pollution in Canada, $30 a ton, and that will continue to increase to $40 a ton and then $50 a ton in the next 2 years, and a goal to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. We think that pipelines are definitely safer than rail. I think we've seen that. And also, of course, we are an ally. And so you know that this oil is coming from a place that is committed to human rights. It's committed to transparency in terms of environmental regulations, et cetera, engaging our communities, our First Nations. We have an extremely strong commitment to that. So I think the conversation around KXL has been a really important one. And I think it's shown us that the future isn't necessarily for or against fossil fuels and for or against climate. You can actually be for both. And I think that that's an important constructive conversation to be having. Up in Canada, we're building the Trans Mountain pipeline, Trans Mountain expansion. So that will take oil sands west. We are trying to diversify our markets and look at other opportunities. However, of course, markets work how they work. So it's possible that that crude will just come on a ship and then come back into the Gulf Coast or somewhere else in the United States. And then we're also looking at a replacement project of the Line 3 in Enbridge. And that would be another 370,000 barrels per day. And we're hopeful that that project will proceed quickly as well.
Related to that, what is the status of the LNG export projects?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We have one great project that I'd like to profile. It's called Lng Canada. And Canada, like the US, is rich in natural resources. And so actually the fourth largest producer of natural gas in the world. We do have some interesting advantages in terms of the low cost availability of natural gas and the market price, 8-day shipping to Asia, as well as some fiscal and policy advantages, such as the lowest federal corporate tax rate in any G7 country at 15%. And so with the LNG facility, one of the interesting things I think is, again, bringing in that climate dimension, because this is going to be the cleanest LNG in the world. It's completely driven by hydropower. Canada's electricity is about 63% hydropower right now, but also with technology that will reduce the emissions. And so we see this as a real step forward in that energy and environment conversation and to help solve the climate question internationally as well. It's a $40 billion project off of the coast of British Columbia, and it is under construction, and the link for the gas pipe was announced yesterday to start.
That's great. I know what the critical impact COVID has had on U.S., Canada energy companies and demand. Kind of jumping back to the oil price drop, Canada has had some interesting responses in relation to how you reacted to that and some of the initiatives that might help keep oil field crews employed.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think, we've done a great job working between Canada and the U.S. as we are navigating this COVID crisis and the oil price crash, oversupply of the market. We've done a great job working together. And so we've made sure that our border stays open to essential travel. And that includes energy services, again, going back to the fact of our energy systems really being the backbone of all of our lifelines, and the fact that our North American energy system is so integrated. Some of the interesting things I think that we've done in Canada for the energy sector connect to the service sector as well. So the energy service companies that have been struggling, we launched what's called an orphan and inactive oil gas well cleanup program, $1.72 billion, and we're working with the governments at the provincial level in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia. And so essentially, these are abandoned and orphaned wells that are creating an environmental liability. And so by investing this money, we're getting people back to work, but we're also creating an environmental benefit. So I think that's really important. And it's been super successful. So in Alberta, they launched the first tranche of the program on May 1st. and they received 34,000 applications for the first phase of the program. And each applicant will receive up to $30,000 to clean up one of the 91,000 well sites that have been identified in Alberta. So really great progress, and I think it's a great initiative getting people back to work.
That is a great initiative, and what an innovative type of response to a crisis that has hit us all globally. We've had such a great long-standing export relationship. Let's turn it over to kind of, can you explain the USMCA and what that looks like kind of going forward for us, what the July 1st date will actually allow us to do, and the current status?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I was in Washington, D.C. for the renegotiation of NAFTA 2.0. The USMCA, as it's called here in the U.S. You know, in the backdrop of this, we have to think about the fact that we have $1.4 million of trade going across our border every minute between Canada and the U.S., $2 billion a day. The U.S. sells more to Canada than China, Japan, and the U.K. combined. And so this agreement is really a modernization. NAFTA was over 25 years old. We knew that it needed some tweaks, but we also knew we wanted a progressive trade agenda that maintained what we had under NAFTA, but also considered our modernized economy and how our economy has changed since then. Trade in North America had actually increased fourfold since NAFTA had come into place. And so I think when you look at what the USMCA preserves, but then modernizes, there's some really good descriptors. We want to maintain the predictability. We also want to reduce red tape. We want to spur innovation. We want to make sure that the supply chains in North America are strong and providing affordable and quality opportunities for consumers. So a couple of things that I would flag in terms of the developments. One of them is in the auto sector, so strengthened rules of origin in terms of certainty for continued market access. Things will be phased in over time, but there will be an additional requirement, for example, of 70% North American steel and aluminum. Also, really unique for a 21st century agreement is the fact that to get the preferential tariff treatment, 40 to 45% of the value of the car has to be produced by labor earning $16 an hour or more. So I think that's really, really interesting. Also, of course, when NAFTA came into force, we did not have Zoom, we did not have Google and Amazon Prime and everything else. And so it considers the digital economy. So it sets rules that will facilitate economic growth and trade through the use of the internet. But it also makes sure that we're thinking about protecting personal information and cooperating on security. Final thing I'll note in terms of some of the modernizations is that progressive trade agenda. So incorporating chapters on environment, on labor, on Indigenous issues, and on gender. So that progressive trade agenda that really brings it into a modernized 21st century agreement.
How do you think it might impact trade specifically here with Canada and Texas?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, you know, Texas exports over $28 billion to us already. So even a small percentage in terms of trade facilitation with reduced red tape, there's a lower threshold for shipping, things like that. But also, you know, the fact that digital service that can happen. When we look at things that are happening in the energy sector, for example, things like artificial intelligence that is informing how the energy sector is working, digital oil field services. So those things could expand. There's an opportunity there. I also always want to say that there's a Canadian complementarity to actual operations that are in Texas. And so I think there's an opportunity both ways to expand global footprints of companies. So for investment both ways. But it's not necessarily a choice between our two countries, but complementary opportunities. Canada has a free trade agreement with all the other G7 countries. We're the only G7 country to have a free trade agreement with all G7 countries. And so a second office or a parallel office in Canada provides American companies that access to 2/3 of the world's market. Also access to some banking opportunities and other things in Canada, which can help what's happening in the US as well. So thinking about things as like an ecosystem, an industrial ecosystem within North America where you know, have different advantages in different locations. I think there's great opportunities for Texas and Canada.
Well, so it really reduces the red tape, reduces cost, allows for some technological infrastructure that really helps our cross-border transactions. So that's really good. I'm pleased to see it, and I'm hopeful that it will be successful. I know you mentioned in your earlier
Me too.
comments First Nations and your Indigenous communities with the increased fight for racial justice having just occurred in the US, but all across the world. Can you speak to the protests in Canada and how you address minority rights, particularly African Canadians and the Indigenous people of Canada?
So yeah, definitely Canadians joined Americans in grieving the loss of George Floyd, and we've been having really important conversations about and to the top of our government. The Prime Minister has said this. Our ministers, our deputy ministers, we're having a great conversation within our public service, within our businesses, about the fact that it's not just enough to be not racist, but it's important to be anti-racist, and that we have to stand up to anti-Black actions. We have to think about the systemic racism and how we as public servants and people can move in the right direction in that regard. And so we are having a really important and engaged conversation, I think, that is recognizing that we're not perfect in Canada by any means, and that we have to think about how Black, Indigenous, people of color in Canada can have the full opportunity that everyone else has. And I think when we look at the way we have addressed things like opportunities for girls and women abroad internationally, we've always said your whole society is better off when everyone can succeed and when everyone has a great opportunity. And so I think, like, thinking about this in terms of opportunity and the richness and diversity that we can bring to the Canadian economy, to the Canadian society, by making sure everybody feels welcome.
It's a great attitude to take. And I know there has been quite a lot of questions that I have received around, we're so close in proximity. We have, so many allegiances, alliances, opportunities to go across the border. How has Canada been affected by COVID? And maybe we can get into some more specific border entry, what that looks like for how we've worked together to make it more streamlined for people to cross the border, and then some of the safeguards that you've implemented.
Sure. I mean, I think it's a testament to the strength of our relationship that as the COVID crisis mounted and we realized what was happening, that we were able to come to an agreement about closing our border to anything but essential travel, and coming to that agreement about what that meant, recognizing how integrated our supply chains are, and that we needed to keep things like food security for our people on both sides of the border. On personal protective equipment, for example, we export a ton to the US and we import a lot from the US, and there's inputs into manufacturing for PPE in the US. And so recognizing we needed to keep that going. We needed to be able to help our communities, help our people, and also keep our economies strong as much as we possibly could, working together. But we saw a reduction in non-essential travel to, very, very low levels. And so, it was quite amazing that we were able to get to that. We also worked together to ensure repatriation of citizens both ways, so that if vulnerable people couldn't get home, we really worked so closely together to make sure we were getting people home safe where they needed to be.
Well, we have a lot of members in our council that are Canadians, and so I'm sure they're happy to kind of learn there's avenues for exchange and to cross the border safely.
Absolutely.
I know that,
And so in my team, we've been helping Canadians still every day right now, many of whom live in Texas and are talking about, can I go home for the summer? What can I do? All these other things. And so one of the important things to consider is that as Canadians do travel home, is that they will have to quarantine for 2 weeks. And so they have to have a real plan, and those quarantine requirements are being enforced. And so having a plan when you get there in terms of getting your groceries to where you are, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Well, you talked about home, and I hear that you're from Saskatchewan, and some people have heard you mention that you feel right at home here in Texas, and that isn't it a little hotter here than it is in Saskatchewan?
Yes, definitely. I always say a bit of strange, an unusual punishment to drop a Canadian girl into Texas in August. It was a bit of a shock. But yeah, I grew up at the top of the Great Plains, and here I am in the southern end of the Great Plains, and the big open skies, but also the warmth of the people. That really authentic, accessible way that people interact in Texas just feels like home to me. I felt so warmly welcomed, not just by the weather, but by the people. And there's so many similarities, I think, in terms of our culture, our connection to the land, the energy sector for Western Canada, so many of those things. I have to say, I was a bit shocked when I went to the state fair last year how many things can be fried. But I guess that just is a testament to the Texas innovation that I'll learn more about in the next few years.
Well, Consul General, it's been our pleasure to host you. When things are in a safer environment, we are going to definitely bring you down to Houston and do something for our members there. Thank you for taking the time out of your day. It's so very important that we understand more about Canada. They are allies that we somehow and sometimes just forget about. So it's great to hear what's going on. Thank you for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, and happy Canada Day.
Happy Canada Day. Goodbye, everyone.